everyone, welcome to my channel, Merely Layla. My name is Layla. If you're watching this, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So, have you ever read a book and then completely forgotten the context of the book, or even like the entire book as a whole? If you have, then we are twins because I am that person. I will literally read a book and then completely forget that it existed, that I even picked it up. When I got into reading around 5th grade, and by the time I was in middle school and high school, I was just reading constantly. Like, I was that girl with her face like stuck in a book. It got to the point where I would read about like 100 to 150 books over like the course of the year, and then I would get certificates and stuff acknowledging the amount of books that I read, and that was kind of like an incentive for me back in the day, because I was like, oh my god, such a big accomplishment, you know. But the sad thing is, like, I never tracked the books that I read. I didn't have a good Goodreads account back then, and I wish I did, because there's a lot of books that I have completely forgotten about and I wish I remembered. But anyways, so this topic has been in my mind like the last couple of weeks, and I've noticed on like whenever I scroll to TikTok or Instagram, I see a lot of people like expressing this sentiment as well, where like they talk about how they completely forget a book, but they remember like emotions that the emotions that the book made them feel. Like, for instance, I can read a really horrible book and I would have like a very hard time recalling specific details as to what made me angry, or like maybe I'll point out like a couple of details here and there that made me mad, but like I can read a book that will make me angry from beginning to end and not tell you specifically what made me angry about the book, but I could tell you the exact emotions I was feeling, where I was when I was reading this book, when I bought this book, what made me pick up this book. Those type of details I can tell you with no trouble at all. But like actual details, sometimes it's hard to recall them. And I used to be like really ashamed about this. Like, it made me feel like I wasn't a good reader because I was forgetting some details. But honestly, after seeing a lot of people's like, you know, sentiments on Instagram and on TikTok, and also after reading the next couple of articles, which I will post in the description box below, I did end up reading a couple of articles, and then I made some notes on them on my laptop, so I'm going to be talking about what I read as well. So it's not like it's not a me thing, it's an us thing basically. But anyways, so I read a couple of articles, and I'll reference them down in the description box below if you want to read them for yourself, because sometimes it's easier to read, you know, understand something when you're reading it for yourself, obviously. But let's see. Honestly, like I was trying to find like scientific articles about this like topic, but to be honest, I wasn't able to find any. I even went on Google Scholar. A lot of the articles I was able to find it was mainly on like memory and why people forget things, but there wasn't one that was like specific to memory and readers, you know. I wish somebody would do that, because I feel like it would be a very fascinating topic. But okay. So one of the main things that I noticed from the articles that I was reading was the topic of working memory. So they claimed that our working memory is actually a very limited thing. And for those of you who don't know what working memory is, it is basically, it refers to the memory used when actively engaging in thinking about a problem. It is very limited. And it also says that research suggests we are only able to attend to 7 or as few as 4 pieces of information at a time. And this statistic is from Miller, 1956. Again, like a lot of the articles will be I'm not going to list every single article I looked at, but a couple of them, you can just refer to them in the description box. Once you reach this working memory limit, then learning basically becomes very diminished, because you've reached the capacity of learning, if that makes sense, right? So when you're reading something, your brain is intaking those details, but then like there's a certain point in which like it stops absorbing said details, if that makes sense. And then I'll post like this little article that I saw, or not article, but like this diagram from the article. It basically talks about like working memory and long-term memory. Basically, working memory is what encodes long-term memory. So everything that you learn when you first learn something, it's considered working memory, but the more you do it, the more it becomes part of your life, then it'll, go on to be like in long-term memory. So basically, like when you first started driving, you were like actively trying to learn how to freaking drive, but then the more that you do it, the more it becomes automatic, and so it's long-term memory. Same with learning how to read. Like when you're initially learning, your brain is just overactively trying to take this information and trying to learn your ABCs. But then because you do it so often, because you're in school from like K to 12 and then college as well, it just becomes something that your brain does automatically without you having to think about it. Okay, so here are some of the points I got from the articles that I read. The first one is that if you're not using the information that you just learned, then you're more likely to forget it. So for example, when you're reading a sentence, if you just like read it once and then move on to the next sentence, you're more likely to forget the previous sentence and only remember the second sentence, right? So that's why like when you're rereading a book, sometimes some of the lines just feel very new to you. It's because you forgot them and you're almost like you're learning them for the first time again. Another point was that intaking too much information can overwork your working memory, which will then lead to a diminishing of it diminishes the learning new information. So I'm going to go back to that previous statistic where it mentions that we are able to attend to 7 or as few as 4 pieces of information at a time, which is why a lot of people say that multitasking is not really a thing. Like you can't read a book and listen to music at the same time because your mind is either on the reading or it's on the music part. Okay, and then I feel like I'm giving a presentation because I literally made a PowerPoint of the points that I jotted down from the articles. Okay, so then the other point was that when you're reading a book, you're often presented with loads of new information, and our working memory begins to struggle with processing all that information. Again, the average person only holds about 4 to 7 pieces of information at a given time. So if you're like one of those people that binges a book in one night, the chances of you remembering a good amount of the book the next day or the next few days, it's gonna be very hard unless you like automatically reread that book because you like it so much. One of the articles also mentioned a phenomenon called the Oedipus forgetting curve. I'm 100% sure I butchered that word. I'm gonna write it right over here so you guys can like look it up for yourselves. But don't come after me, okay? German is a really hard language to learn. But anyways, this experiment was done by a German scientist in 1885. He basically did a set of experiments on himself where he would memorize nonsense syllables, and then he would basically test his recall. So he found that he forgot most of the words or most of the syllables that he learned. In fact, his experiment showed that within 20 minutes, he forgot about 40% of the syllables that he learned. And after a day, 24 hours, he forgot about 70% of the syllables that he had learned. So it basically illustrates how we quickly forget stuff that we don't actively use. When you forget stuff, it's not because you're dumb or it's not because you're slow. It's because your brain, it's taking in so much information at one time that remembering everything is going to be a challenge for anybody, unless you have like photographic memory or something like that. So don't be too hard on yourself like I was. The articles also mentioned ways we can recall information. So the first one was active recall and spaced repetition. So basically, maybe like when you're reading a book, stop yourself and think about the thing that you just read. Think about the paragraph that you just read, just to like make sure that you're actively like engaging with what you're reading. And then another thing is to stop binge reading books. If you want to remember like specific details, or if you want to remember like the whole book as a whole, basically. So grouping like chapters, like reading a certain amount of chapters a night, and then the next day reading another certain amount of chapters, and basically like spacing it out over the span of a week, couple of weeks, basically for however long you need it. Like it's not important for you to finish a book in one night. Like it's fun. I do it. It's fun, but if you want to get like the most out of the book that you're reading, then try to space it out over the span of, you know, a long period of time, more than a day. Yeah. So another recommendation that they had was chunking the information that you're learning. So they stated that we forget because we're trying to process too much information at once, more likely, which, you know, causes us to forget the stuff that we're trying to learn. And so by chunking it, and if you don't know what chunking means, it's basically like a process of organizing information into meaningful chunks. So a good example the article used was like remembering phone numbers. Like instead of trying to remember like one digit at a time, you group it, right? So if your like area code is like 602, and then like you don't say 602 to remember it, you will say 602 chunk, and then the next number chunk, and then the next number chunk. So this like chunking information for me specifically is very helpful when you're trying to learn something in school. And it also works with like spacing stuff out, because you're like pausing to give yourself enough time to really absorb the stuff that you're learning. And then the third point was taking notes or annotating. So when you're taking notes or annotating, you're basically forcing yourself to engage with the text that you're reading, right? So you're pausing again, you're thinking about what you wrote, and then you're adding your thoughts, you know, or like writing notes, like writing down specific quotes that you found inspirational from whatever you're reading. So I think note taking is not as common for like readers, at least the readers that are reading books for fun. But annotating books, I feel like has become very popular over the last few years, especially with like all the cool bookmarks that you could be using and the sticky notes, and just, yeah, I see beautifully like annotated books all the time on Instagram and on TikTok. It's very like, it's become very aesthetic for people nowadays, but it looks pretty, but it also like, it's very good for your brain, because you're actually, it's helping you process and engage with what you're reading, basically. And then another point was like mnemonics. Mnemonics are, to me, again, like more specific for like learning instead of like reading for fun. But basically, if you don't know what mnemonics are, it's basically organizing and remembering information by associating it with something else that's easier to remember. You can make rhymes or like songs. A good example the article used was the ABC song. So A, B, C, D, E, F, G, which, you know, it's a song, so it's catchy, it's easy to learn, so you end up remembering it much faster than just trying to remember each letter at a time. Let's see, what else did I write down? I don't know if it's considered mnemonics, but recently I learned how to say blood in Spanish, and it's sangre, and I remember it because sangre sounds like sangria, so I'm like, sangre, sangria, they're both red-ish, in the red hue, but okay. And then the last point that I got was mind mapping. So mind mapping is basically making diagrams of what you're learning or reading. I don't think this is very necessary when you're reading a book for enjoyment. If you're trying to like learn certain things, maybe from like a self-help book, or, you know, the how-to books or whatever that's out there, if you're like specifically trying to learn something, then maybe doing diagrams can help you. But for me, I read for fun, so I'm not gonna sit there and draw maps. But the cool thing is, like, a lot of fantasy books, if you're a fantasy reader, will have maps of the realm in which like your story takes place. So what I find myself doing oftentimes is I'll like refer back to the map whenever they're talking about a certain location, just to orient myself, you know. yeah, that could also help with your memory and recall. If you're a reader and you read books for fun and you're trying to remember the books that you read, I think the main takeaway for me is to not binge read and to space things out and maybe annotate like what you're reading. And I feel like this will be very helpful for people that are on like book clubs where you're actually required to talk about your book, the book that you're reading, where like your aim is to discuss it with others. My aim is not that. Like I've joined a couple of book clubs, but I'm not an active member, which is really bad, and I need to fix that. I just don't have the time. But yeah, if you're like an active member of a book group, of a book club, and you want to remember specific details, then maybe annotating it is going to be the best route for you, and also not binge reading it at once, because at least like if you are going to binge read it, maybe like repeat it, you know. Repetition is always a really good way of remembering things. So if you do end up binge reading it, then make sure you reread it so that you can absorb the other details your mind kind of did not process at that time. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I think this is a really interesting topic, and I wish somebody would do like a scientific research on why readers forget a lot of the books. I really wanted like a scientific journal about this topic, but I honestly was not able to find any of that. You're more likely to find like Reddit posts, a couple of articles here and there that talks about this topic, but nothing like that's scientifically done. You're more likely to find stuff about like scientific articles specific to like memory and recall, and other things. There isn't anything that's like memory recall directed at book readers, at readers. That's all I have to say about this topic. I hope you guys found it interesting like I did. Yeah, and I hope it made sense and it wasn't as chaotic as it felt, because I get really nervous whenever I film myself, and when I'm nervous I will ramble and I will say nonsensical things. Some of the words that come out of my mouth aren't even English, you know. But anyways, that is it. Bye.